an inscription by Ashok. On the other side, you have an inscription by Samudragupta. And then you have some random inscriptions by various people, including Shankhalipi, which means that sadhus, etc., were visiting this particular pillar. And then you have Jahangir also carving on it. So think about how important would this object be, this object of art be for people, that they keep reusing it to inscribe and to show their symbols of power, right? So for me, visual is not just about, or a visual source tells us a very much more than just what you can see. So you can see this ayat from the Quran, fine. But what does it mean? Why is it there where it is? Yahan par hi kyun? Our friend Jahangir was a rich man. He could have carved another pillar, right? Why does he carve this on a pillar? Because this pillar, because of its visual value. Remember, nobody can read the Brahmi on it. But because it is already a powerful image, that is why he uses this. Now, the same can be said about a lot of pillars which are in situ. For example, the one here, which is on the southern side of Sanchi. So you can see how it also, there is probably a railing around it, which gives it a sacred character. Why does a pillar originally become important? The pillar originally becomes important because it is linked to the Vedic skambha, or a sacrificial post, or a object that connects the nether world, or with waters on it, the earth and the heaven. So it is a skambha. It has a certain ritual value, where skambhas are being worshipped. We know that they are being worshipped. So Ashoka, when he starts inscribing some of the pillars, he is doing it because pillars are obviously have a ritual and a symbolic value which predates the Mauryans, right? So as an object of art, it is a ritual object. Okay? So here you have the Ashokan pillar, which has been built next to a stupa. Now, the core of the stupa is Ashokan. Then the same stupa goes through the same kind of a process. That Ashokan stup is enlarged by the Shungas, or during the Shunga era, and then it is embellished further with Toranas during the Shatavahana period by various people. It's not a royal monument. It's donated by a lot of people, communities, individuals, etc. So what we have is a amalgamation of piety, which is coming from all quarters, that contributes to the building of this. So next to an imperial object, you have an object of community patronage. So another aspect that we need to see is who built what. Why did they build this? Does their building something that is patronage carry value for the object that we are studying? What value does it carry? How can we read this in the social, political, and economic, as well as religious milieu of that age? Right. Now, methodologically, if we look at an object, right, there are two things. Here we have a small relief sculpture from Kanagahali, which says Raya Ashoko. It is there somewhere. An inscription here says Raya Ashoko. So this has been read as Ashok with his wives or servitors, and a similar depiction at Sanchi has also been therefore said that this is also Ashoka, because it's very similar in the way these two have been represented. What does it tell us about methodology? All right. That till we found the Kanagahali inscribed slab, we did not know that this was Ashoka, right? Or the one at Sanchi was Ashoka. We just thought it was some royal king with his queens. This gives us methodologically, this is what we call comparative identification. That is, you compare one object with another object, and if you can date one object or identify one object, you can compare it with another similar object and say this probably also is the same thing. So if this is Raja Ashok, then this is also Raja Ashok, because similarity in depiction. So this is comparative identification, one methodological tool. Similarly, we will be looking at style also. We will also be looking at chronology. This I am just giving you an example of identification as to how do we identify it when we don't have any textual sources telling us that this is who we are looking at. There are textual sources also, which we will come to, like this, right? Now, in this, we have no inscription, right? We have absolutely no inscription, but we know or we identify this as the disfiguring of Shrupnakha by Lakshmana while Ram and Sita look on. This is from Deogar and is probably dated to about 575 AD, the second half of the 6th century. Why are we identifying this as the disfiguring of Shrupnakha? Because we have a solid textual basis to do this. We have Valmiki's Ramayana, and then also we have the Raghuvansham. In the last 5 cantos, we have the story of Rama in the and in this particular episode has been described. Secondly, by the time we come to the 6th century, we have the beginnings of the iconography of the avatars being formalized, and Ram is being shown with a bow and arrow here that you can see. So what you get here is this kind of a identification which is based on textual sources, right? Now, having said that, if as an art historian, I would call this just one level. This will bring me to a art historian called Panofsky, right? Now, Panofsky has given us various stages of analysis of an art object, okay? The first stage is iconographic and the second is iconological. Now, what is iconography and what is iconology? Iconography would be something like identification. So you identify this as Ram, Lakshman, Shiva, and so on and so forth. That's one level. Now, the other, which he calls, it's, trying to read what it means symbolically. That is iconological. That is, that it tells us what meanings it carried for the people who made it. So he calls it the national spirit. But let's not go into the national spirit, but let's just see what meanings would an art object carry. So for that, what we need to do methodologically is to understand context. Okay. How do we understand context? For that, we need to know where is it coming from, when was it being written, when was it being made, what are the kind of sources that it is borrowing from? So we know that this is borrowing from Ramayana, right? Or the Ram Katha. At least the Ram Katha, we know it's borrowing from the Ram Katha. Secondly, I was very interested, and this is something I've done, is that uh, I've tried to see where is this Deogar, right? That Deogar is in a heavily forested area of Madhya Pradesh. Well, actually, technically UP, but Madhya Pradesh, let's put it, which was part probably of the uh, Attavika Rajas, that is forest kings, and they are narrating, or they're getting a temple made of where Ramayana and Bhagavad Puran are being illustrated. Ramayana, which episodes are being illustrated? The ones that deal with the Aryanaka Kand or the Kishkinda Kand. So that means that they are interested, very interested in the forest, because this is the kind of environment which they are inhabiting. So I think that reading this also in its geopolitical context helps us in trying to understand why this particular theme was being chosen. There are ways in which we can also look at the theological context. For me, I have read it as redemption, how uh, Rama and Ram, Sita, Lakshman are seen as redemptive forces, or they are seen as upholding the dharma, and so on and so forth. One can also read it in a gendered way, because Shrupnakha, a woman is being, her nose is being cut off. One can also look at it as representing a moment in the story which sets the rest of the story forward. If Shupnaka had not been disfigured, how would the narrative have worked? So, for the narrative to move forward, for the war to have happened, right? It is necessary that Shupnaka episode is shown, is narrated, because it sets forth the entire story henceforth, right? So, just looking at this, what do we read? And then looking at the context, what do we read? We can look at it in terms of the kind of clothes that they are wearing. And this will bring me to another methodological point, which is that in reading a visual source, we need to read four important things. One is posture, one is attire, that is their dress, one is the gaze, right? Because how do we look at it? How do they look at the, where is the internal gaze, right? And I think it is also important to read, the environment. So we've done environment, we've done the posture. Look at the postures, how are they standing, who is bigger, who's smaller, what is the action that is happening. All that will come under that. Then we come to the attire part of it. Very interestingly, that they are dressed partly as ascetics and partly as warriors. So they have this ascetic jatas of the renouncer, and they are wearing this their weapons, and this is known as a chanavira, or something that holds the anvil, the arrow, bow and arrow thing, the arrows together. What does this mean? Right? How do we interpret this? Because in the textual source, when they change their clothes from the royal attire to renouncing their royalty, they become ascetics or forest dwellers. So they wear barks and so on and so forth. But remembering their Kshatriya dharma, that they have to protect, the dharma, they have to protect the sages, they have to whatever hunt and so on and so forth, they carry arms. So this particular aspect of ascetic warriors is very important to reading a particular this particular depiction. It could be something else, it needs not be just this. But this is again from the same site, same kind of interpretative framework we can see, except that this is an episode that is before he is married to Sita. And this is in another ashram where Ram is redeeming Ahalya, and this is Gautam Rishi who had originally cursed Ahalya, and Ram, through the touch of Ram, she is coming back to form. So the ashramic atmosphere is there. You have the Gautam Rishi, but you would notice that unlike Ram and Lakshman, he is not wearing Kshatriya attire, he's not wearing weapons. What he's holding is a rosary or a prayer necklace in his hand, prayer beads in his hand. All right. Having said this about the warriors, right? Now we come to another set of depictions. I'm taking you back a little more in time. This is Kushana period, all right? Of the 4, I don't know how many of you are ancient India actually. So I might, for those who are not ancient India, let me repeat this, that from Mathura, near Mathura, there is a place called Mart. From Mart, a Devakula or a royal sanctuary was found. That is where 4 statues of the Kushana kings were being worshipped, probably worshipped. And this particular Devakul was set up by the Kshatrap, Raju, and I won't go into the details. But the fact is that you have portrait sculptures of 4 kings in this particular. Okay. So, but what we do have here, if you would notice, is that he is wearing an attire which is very different from that of these people, right? He's wearing a long tunic over which he's wearing a coat, he's wearing boots, and he's carrying 2 swords with a belt. We don't have the head, but the head is usually helmeted. This is known as Northerners' attire. This is a very important kind of a differentiation that we have, because the Kushanas were coming from the northwestern. Okay, these were coming from the northwestern India and central Asia and then northwestern India. They wear clothes which are seen as Shak Scythian, right? And often we have a description of these in texts. So even cults that are identified with Central Asia, such as the cult of Surya, okay, that is identified with northwestern India. Here also you will notice that Surya is wearing a tunic and boots. This is very interesting because for me, at least, what I feel is important here is that attire, is giving us the context. Where are they coming from? How do we identify them? How did people look at them, right? People who are sculpting, or people who are coming to witness this, people who see these, they immediately can say, okay, these are the Northwestern Central Asian people. This is a royal portrait sculpture. All right. Now we come to something that is very interesting, right? We come to methodologically, how do we look at style as a marker of reading visual histories, right? These are two contemporary depictions of the same person, the Buddha. One is from Katra, which is in Mathura, and one is from, I think, Taktebahi, which is in Gandhar. Okay, northwestern India and North India, right? Both of them are part of the Kushana Empire. First, okay, now given, and both can be roughly dated to late 2nd, 3rd century CE. But do you see the difference? All right. Do you can you see the difference? Look at the way the Singhasan has been made. Let's start from the bottom onwards, right? From here, you can see how this Singhasan has been made, right? Can I call you later? Okay. Yeah. So, right. Then we come, this is an inscribed thing. It tells us who made it, when was it made, and so on and so forth. Then we come to the dress and the Sanghati. All right. The Sanghati, the Chivar, so on and so forth. The difference in the attire. Here he's shown wearing a dhoti with a Sanghati covering one shoulder. Here you see that he's wearing a more detailed dhoti, which probably goes to his feet, ankles, and he's wearing a Sanghati that is covering both his shoulders, right? However, this is not all. Then we look at the shape of the head, the features. So it is oval, this is more round. These are look at the curls, right? Here, and the curls here. Look at the ushnish or the top knot. This is the Kapardin kind, this is the ushnish. Very interestingly, the halo or the prabha. Here on the prabha, you have these two celestial Gandharva beings, and this is a scalloped edge, so on and so forth. So we can say that they are two distinct styles of making the same object, right? Why? Then we come to the layer behind it, which is, why is there this difference of style, right? Because this particular style, Gandhar, if we were to look at it in terms of its geography, historical geography, is at the crossroads of cultures. So you have Indo-Greek, you have Shakparthian, you have Romans, so on and so forth. So this particular style is being influenced by that kind of cross-culturality. It is borrowing from three sources. It's borrowing from the local base, but in terms of its theme, it's borrowing in terms of the plasticity, in terms of this kind of sharp folds that you are getting. It's borrowing from, or it's being influenced. I won't say borrowing, it's being influenced by the Indo-Greek or the Hellenistic kind of a influence of the classical arts. It is also borrowing in part from uh, uh, from the Iranians or the Scythians here in terms of this, right? The but here, what we are seeing is that you have it is deriving from a previous tradition of making the yakshas, and it is also incorporating within it the two gods, the Vedic gods, Brahma and Indra. It is also, including within it celestials. So there is this kind of a difference of style, which is helping us understand the kind of milieu, historical milieu, that is producing these particular objects. Now we come to same period, Amravati, same object, the Buddha, but there is a difference in style again, right? It is more elongated, more classical, more flexible in terms of body, so on and so forth. This is because another set of influences is at work here, where you have partly Roman influence, partly, it is coming from a local tradition of sculpting. There are, we see that the same object during the same time period is stylistically different, and this is very important methodologically. Now we come to another methodological way of looking at it, right? I am at the moment talking about uh, that this, how do we read the same object in different time periods, right? This is an object of an art element which is called the Yakshi Shalabhanjika, right? It gets called the Yakshi, then the Shalabhanjika. It also gets called the Alasya Kanyas and the Sursundaris and even Devanganas. So these are various names for this, for a similar kind of a depiction. What is the core of this depiction? The core of this depiction is a young woman, right? A young woman who is shown in various sensuous poses, doing various kinds of activities, some of which involve a tree, but not necessarily so. This has been interpreted as representing the idea of fertility that is embodied by young women. So, by sculpting these objects on various temples, stupas, and so on and so forth, what is being attempted here is to show or to give fertility, one, to the architectural piece that is being embellished through this, so stupa, temple, and so on and so forth. The other is to give fertility or transfer fertility to the viewer. So anybody who comes to view and worship is this particular object will also give fertility to that. It is based on an older belief system that is older than the sculpted pieces, where young women were associated with fertility and were considered to be tree spirits, or were considered to be spirits of flowers and mountains and so on and so forth. These are called yakshis. This you see in a lot of Jaina and Buddhist literature, right? Having said that, what does one do with this information, right? How does one read the continuity of this architectural element? For me, these are not real women. Now, why I've chosen these is because these are not real women. Please remember these. These are architectural elements. These are always meant to embellish and give a symbolic value to structure. It could be a vihara, it could be a prasada, it could be a stupa, any or cave, so on and so forth. You see it everywhere. It's even on furniture bags, right? So why? I'll do why and then I'll see how this develops. Because women, beautiful women, okay, are attractive. They also lend beauty to the architectural edifice that they are embellishing. Secondly, of course, they do carry within them symbolic value. It says in one of the texts of the 9th century called Shilp Prakash from Orissa that a Nari Bandh, that is a band with women, is very important for the temple because without the Nari Bandh, it will give no fruit. That is, it will not give any benefit. So, to give benefit, okay, of fertility and union and so on and so forth, you have to have the Nari Bandh, right? This is also seen in other texts. Already we've talked about the Shilpa Shastras. So other Shilpa Shastras also talk about the need to have these kind of Nari Bandhas. Okay? Or now we come to the chronology. So this, if you would notice, is known as the Toran Shalbhanjika, and this is part of this the Torana of the Sanchi Stup number 1 or the Mahastupa. She is standing on a little overhang or a thing, and she's holding a branch with her hands. She's obviously shown in a very beautiful, sensuous way, and you can see that there is a flowering tree that she's entwined with. This Shalbhanjika, okay, is something that is mentioned in Rajaprashniya Sutra, which is and other agamic text, Jaina agamic texts as embellishing, as being alankar of mansions and temples and so on and so forth. Then you have the Natya Shastra also saying that Shalashris should be made on the backdrop, right? You also have mentioned in the Buddha Charita that a sensuous woman looked like a Toran Shalbhanjika. So basically, beauty, sensuousness are being associated with these particular figures. Now we come to Mathura. This can be dated to the 1st century CE. Now we come to Mathura, this is from Bhuteshwar Mount, and it is part of a stupa reading. Again, part of the stupa. This also stupa, this is also stupa. So here you see that there are 3 yakshi, so-called yakshis or stamba yoshitas, who are standing against these pillars, and they are one is holding a parrot cage, one is wearing this necklace, and so on and so forth. All of them are on dwarf yakshas. There are these spectator couples on top. This is a coping stone. But here you see that from being entwined, you don't have entwining here, but they are also shown in a very sensuous, provocative manner, right? The same kind of a motif you see in the Gupta period, which can be dated to this one particular, can be dated to the late 5th century CE. This is in Udaygiri, right? And here, instead of the railing, she becomes part of the door. And on the upper part of the door, you have her again, like the Shalbhanjika, being shown here. Then you come to Khajuraho, right? At Khajuraho, you have lots of these Devanganas or Sursundaris. In this case, she is taking out a thorn from her foot. Again, this is seen as a mark of beauty. So, being bitten by a scorpion, talking to a parrot, all of these are activities which are seen as sensuous. Again, these are interspersed uh, all along the temple walls. This is again from she's dancing, and she has her foot against probably a tree. And this is a Sursundari or a Alasakanya from an Orisan temple. I won't go into the details, right? This is the Deogar temple, which we had seen in terms of the Ramayana panels. The Ramayana panels should have been put here, right? But we come to the main part of the temple, right? In the main part of the temple, this is about, I've already said about the 6th century, second half of the 6th century. You have the door frame, and then you have these niche sculptures. Methodologically, okay, we've been reading till now style. Now I come to content and theme, right? That while iconography starts developing from the second century CE mainly in North India, it really comes into its own during the Gupta and the post-Gupta period, when Puranas and epics start being narrated on temple walls, and they keep getting more and more elaborate. One of the first examples of this is at Deogar. So I'm just going to show you Deogar at the moment, where you see this very complex kind of a depiction that is happening, where iconography as well as narrative are being woven together, right? For by narrative, I mean the myths that are associated with Vishnu, which are there in Bhagavad Puran, which are there in Vishnu Puran, Garur Puran, and so on and so forth. Now, they are being narrated through temples and temple walls, sculptures on temple walls. The iconography is, we all know, Vishnu with his ayudhas or his attributes. He has Shankha, Gada, so on and so forth. But here, what you see is Vishnu, who is Sheshashayi Vishnu, sleeping on the Shesha. This is probably Yoga Nidra, who is trying to wake him up from his cosmic sleep. You have here Kartikeya, Indra, Brahma, Uma Maheshwar, and other subsidiary gods, right? Who are being shown as, because Vishnu is the main object of worship, these are all shown as subsidiary gods. They are showing, paying obeisance or being part of the narrative. This is again from Deogar, another story which is related to Vishnu, which is of Nara and Narayana being shown. Now, why does iconography start? It starts because of a particular historical context. The historical context is that around the 2nd century CE, there is a expansion of the Vedic civilizational structure into hitherto non-Vedic areas. And when they start expanding, the Yagya Paddhati starts changing, and you have the concept of bhakti coming in into many, into almost all sects. So, what is bhakti? Surrender to a personal God. For that, you need to focus worship on something. You need to focus your worship on a Ishta Devta or a personal God. This personal God now starts getting personified or anthropomorphized in sculpture. So it gets an iconic form. Secondly, that it derives from what is this iconic form that it's getting? It is deriving from 2 or 3 major sources. One is the pre-existing Yaksha Yakshi worship, which already has a sculpture form. Second, it is deriving from the Vedic word images. So if you look at the Vedas and its hymns, you have this entire notion of the it says this God should look like this. He has a red flames. He is carrying so and so. He's holding so and so. So this kind of a word picture has already been made in the Vedas, and this is one source from where it is deriving. The iconography is deriving, and maybe part of the inspiration is also coming from Hellenistic models, where you have Hellenistic Iranian models, but this is something that's very debatable. That you have the Zeus, Apollo, and so on and so forth figures being made, and they may have inspired or given the idea of anthropomorphized worship. But again, I'm saying this is a very debatable point. Nevertheless, images start being made in the 2nd century CE in great variety and quantity in order to focus worship. So you have, this is one of the first images of Vishnu, and Vishnu is shown in his Vyuha form from that is emanating. So you have 3 other figures emanating from him. You can see Sankarshan or Balram here holding a wine cup. And then you would have Pradyumna and Anirudh also. This is where you can see very early you have a chakra and probably a Padma, etc. Now this is 5th century, where you have the avatars being absorbed, or a combined image of Vishnu Vasudev with Narsimha and Varaha that starts being made. It starts in North India, especially in Kashmir, and continues to become popular elsewhere. So what basically is happening is, and through this, what I'm trying to show you is not just chronology, not just how it develops over time, but also how the idea and how there is a sectarian spread. And this can be read through visual sources. कि जैसे जैसे कोई रिलीजन या सेक्ट जोर पकड़ता है या वो पॉपुलर होता है, वो हम विजुअलिटी के थ्रू भी देख सकते हैं. कई बार हमारे पास टेक्सचुअल सोर्सेज हैं. Sometimes we don't have textual sources which are, or inscriptional sources which are telling us about this. But when we see this, when we see the spread of a particular iconographic form, we can see how a sect is gaining popularity over time and space. For example, this Vaikuntha Vishnu image, this is, okay, so you have one, the Vyuha form, then you have the simple Vishnu, you have Vishnu with 2 other forms here, Then you have the personified Gada Devi and Chakra Purush here. This is from Kashmir. And then you have in the Lakshmana temple in Khajuraho, which says clearly that this has been brought after victory over Kashmir, because this form of Vishnu is associated with North India and Kashmir. So the spread, even if it was not brought actually from Kashmir, but the fact that they are building this and saying this shows that there is a lot of interaction and spread of the iconography of Vaikuntha Vishnu all over North India. So we can actually read these kind of iconographies. Now, why I say this is also look at this particular iconography of Vishnu and look at this Chaturbhuja iconography of Vishnu. So, there is a difference, one that is so-called inspired by Kashmir and one which is completely in the Chandela style. And this again is because they are not asserting that kind of a political domination and religious domination that they are doing in the Lakshmana temple thing. I don't really have time, but I'll very quickly go through the Shaiva thing. So, Shaiva iconography really starts from Guddimallam in Andhra Pradesh, 2nd century BCE, which I don't have at the moment. I don't think I have it in this presentation, but it becomes very popular in central India during the Gupta period. Will not go into that. Now, the other important thing that I want to tell you about is how there is a synergy also between two mediums, right? So during the same time period, Gupta Vakataka time period, you have the same kind of features and hairstyles, etc., being shown also in painting. So one is sculpture, one is painting. So the same sensibility, the same stylistic features, the same kind of theological and symbolic meanings are being built into various mediums. You can just see a more detailed version in the paintings because you can see more details in terms of what these curls would have looked like, what the half open, semi meditative eyes, introspective eyes would have looked like in sculptures, right? Very briefly, architecture also is important in understanding chronology and meaning thereof. It starts off with a very simple, the temple, for example, starts off as a very simple structure with a garbhagriha and a pradakshina, right? This is temple number 17. Just a minute. He must be outside. Okay. Two very elaborate structure. The meaning remains the same. It is still housing the god. The Garbhagriha, this Garbhagriha is now somewhere under this, enclosed somewhere under this. But you see that the Pradakshina now goes inside. You have many more halls and mandapas being added. You have the Shikhara coming up or the superstructure coming up with many other features being added to this. So one can also look at chronology, one can look at regional styles. In the same time period of Khajuraho, the Lingaraj or the Rekhadul temples of Orissa would be different. So you can actually read regional styles, you can read a lot of information in terms of architecture also. So methodologically, each of these carries meaning, symbolic meaning, it carries stylistic meaning, it carries chronological meaning, right? So this is the symbolic meaning that it has. It is based on mandalas. It is based on the Purusha, the iconography of the Purusha. So each of the temples is based on the iconography of the Purusha. So if you have questions, please ask me. I know that there is so much information and I can't give it all in one lecture. That is why I have just given you some brief highlights. If you have questions, I'll be very happy to answer any of these. Anybody?
Thank you, ma'am, for amazing lecture and discussion. Uh, Ma'am, delving into the chronology and style of sculpture and architecture in India, ma'am shed light on how to read visual sources for history writing. In this context, ma'am also described a lots of symbolic social messages, quotes, uh, how deep are related to other materials, and how trace it and use visual sources such as sculptures, images, terracotta, inscriptions, coins, and textual evidences in our research. Also, ma'am cited many inscriptions and epic literature used in how to use in research. We learned a lot and benefited from your lecture. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I can log off now, or are there
If,
questions?
if you want any question, please ask to ma'am. Please.
Ma'am, thank you so much, ma'am. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah, yeah, you're audible. Please.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very interesting lecture. Ma'am, actually, you were talking about some inscriptions and scriptures from northwestern India. My question is that, ma'am, I read Cunningham and some Tibetologists like Franken, Pitek were talking in their books. They were talking about the rock inscriptions of Brahmi, Kharoshthi, and even Shraddha scripts from Ladakh region, ma'am, like
Yeah.
Alchi,
Mhm,
Zanskar, and other regions.
mhm.
So I haven't come across any textbook in they are in representing that inscriptions in visuals, ma'am. So my question is, ma'am, is it so? Have you ever come across those inscriptions in visuals, ma'am? I just
Uh,
want.
yeah, ma'am, you want to know whether there is a correspondence between inscriptions and visuals, or you want to know whether these have been located within Alchi and She and other monasteries and in Ladakh. So if you want to look at a study, then there is one on Key by Lakshman Thakur, which I think is an important one. Then you can look at Deborah Slater Kimberg. I think that's also an important work that you can actually look at. There are, of course, very specific studies on Alchi also. It'll just come back to me. I think Gerard Kosic has done some work on that. You can also have a look at that because there are the white temples and the there are different structures within these, and these are also related to Western Tibet. So don't shouldn't be reading Ladakh in isolation. We should also be looking at Ladakh in terms of how it is associated with Western Tibetan structures. So I think that's a very interesting point that you raised, that yes, you do have a lot of correspondence between the petroglyphs. You know, these are, you know, we've also found petroglyphs in Ladakh, which can be read in terms of the larger Trans-Himalayan zone, both east and west. So you should also be looking at Gilgit, you'll be looking at that area. And it's very interesting that you have travelers who are leaving their marks. They are making petroglyphs, they are making stupas, they are making writing short inscriptions in Kharoshti, in Gandhari, they are writing in Shankars. So they are leaving their marks on this area when they are traveling. These could be traders, it could be monks, they could be. So it is not just only about Buddhism. It is partly about Buddhism, but it's also telling us about stories of transmission as to how these people are traveling and carrying visual cultures with them. Okay? Textual, literary, visual cultures with them. Right? In fact, Hyun Sang himself says that when he goes back from India, he not only carries 14 mules or 13, I don't know, mules of texts, but he's also carrying sculptures. You know, he's carrying some sculptures that he's collected, probably bronze or brass sculptures. And these he brings to China, and then they influence the iconography that is there in China. Okay? This is known as transculturality.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, anybody else who has any kind of a question? Okay.
Hello. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I'm Mahendra Pratap,
Yeah.
AMU from you. My question is, in the visual art sculptures, so the culture in a particular period in the history, so how is we classified the different era and the different time periods because many structures, many visual arts and entities do not show the times and only carbon dating are, and some arts do not show the times and so show the places but do not show the times. So how classified and include in history license?
All right. So now you see, most sculptures can't be carbon dated because they are stone. Stone can't be carbon dated. So if you have a terracotta, there you can have TL or the thermoluminescence method in order to date them. However, 90% of sculptures that we find which are surface finds or not associated with the temple. Okay, how do we date those? Right? So there are various ways in which art historians date them. One is based on comparison, right? So if you have, say, something that looks like something, right? Based on style. This is the same style, so this is the Chandela sculpture. So we can date the Chandelas from the 10th to the 12th century. So we can date that particular sculpture based on style. This is Gandhar, this is early Gandhar, mature Gandhar, and so on and so forth. So we can date it according to style. Secondly, you know, and remember that it's not as if material is one thing. One thing is that if you get a spotted sandstone, red spotted sandstone, we know it's from the Sikri, Mathura area. So it must have been carried to Sanghor, it may have been carried to Varanasi, it may have been carried to Shravasti. So we know that area, sometimes you can date it according to area also, you know, that you have a particular material which is only found in a particular spot. Chunar sandstone. Okay, Ashok and Chunar sandstone gets very popular. Of course, other people have also used Chunar, right? but one can at least say that it's coming from a particular region, so we can kind of say what the origin of that particular object is. So it was, whether it is the Ashokan pillars or the Dargan Yakshi and so on and so forth, the stone is coming from Chunar. There's a centralized quarry there. So I hope that answers your question about material and about chronology. In terms of absolute chronology, now how do we place things according to absolute chronology? Is there something called absolute chronology? This again is a question that is very complex, because to say that Bharut, that's something because they are not given plasticity, you understand? Roundedness, all right? So it doesn't have that kind of a plasticity, it doesn't have that three-dimensionality, therefore it is older, okay? This is one argument that was made in the old times, that this is an archaic style, this is a more developed style, this is a mature style, and so on and so forth, right? Now, this particular kind of an argument is something that we need to revisit. We need to collaborate and to corroborate with other sources, right? So we need to corroborate with sources such as inscriptions, coins, etc. That is there an inscription in a similar kind of a? Just a minute. Okay, and the last thing that I want to say about chronology is that it requires training, right? आपको देख के पता लगता है बहुत often, क्योंकि आपने बहुत देख लिया होता है कि ये probably इस time period का है, ठीक है? Okay. Anybody else? What was the question? So I think we are finished. आप म्यूट पे हैं.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.